The beacon in the storm. The storm raged with a fury that seemed almost sentient, as if the sea itself had awakened to challenge the fragile wooden vessel that dared to cross its domain. Captain Elias Veyra gripped the wheel of the siren's call, his knuckles white as the ship pitched and rolled beneath him. The crew, seasoned as they were, moved with a frantic urgency, securing lines and battening down hatches. The wind howled like a wounded beast, and the rain lashed against the deck in sheets, stinging like needles. Elias had been at sea for nearly 2 decades, and he prided himself on his ability to navigate the most treacherous waters. But this storm was different. It had come out of nowhere, a tempest born of some unnatural force. The barometer had dropped so rapidly that it seemed to defy the laws of nature. And now, as the siren's call was tossed like a toy in the hands of a petulant child, Elias felt a gnawing dread in the pit of his stomach. "Captain!" shouted First Mate Garrick, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "We're taking on water in the hold. The pumps can't keep up." Elias cursed under his breath. "Get every available hand on the pumps. If we don't keep her afloat, we're done for." Garrick nodded and disappeared into the chaos, shouting orders as he went. Elias turned his attention back to the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of respite. But there was nothing, just the endless, churning blackness of the storm. And then, through the driving rain, he saw it. A light. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm, a flicker of lightning playing tricks on his eyes. But no, it was steady, unwavering. A beacon in the darkness. A lighthouse. Elias felt a surge of relief. A lighthouse meant land. Land meant safety. He adjusted the ship's course, steering toward the light. The crew, seeing the beacon as well, redoubled their efforts, their faces alight with hope. As the siren's call drew closer, the light grew brighter, cutting through the storm like a blade. Elias could see the outline of the lighthouse now, a tall, slender structure perched on a rocky outcropping. But something about it felt off. The light was too bright, too intense. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. "Captain," Garrick said, appearing at his side. "That lighthouse, it's not on any of the charts." Elias frowned. He had sailed these waters countless times, and he knew every island, every rock, every shoal. But Garrick was right, there was no record of a lighthouse here. Still, they had no choice. The ship was taking on water, and the storm showed no signs of abating. They had to reach that lighthouse. As they drew closer, the storm began to abate, as if the lighthouse had some power over the elements. The wind died down, and the rain lessened to a drizzle. The crew, exhausted and drenched, began to cheer. But Elias felt no such relief. There was something about this place that set his teeth on edge. The siren's call finally came to rest in a small, sheltered cove at the base of the lighthouse. The island itself was small and barren, with no signs of life. The lighthouse loomed above them, its light still pulsing with that strange, hypnotic rhythm. "Garrick," Elias said, his voice low, "take a few men and secure the ship. I'm going to see if there's anyone in that lighthouse." Garrick nodded, though his expression was uneasy. Elias grabbed a lantern and made his way up the rocky path to the lighthouse. The door was old and weathered, the wood warped and cracked. He knocked, but there was no answer. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, the lighthouse was dark and cold. The air smelled of salt and decay. Elias raised his lantern, the light flickering off the walls. The interior was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture and a spiral staircase leading up to the light. "Hello?" Elias called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. "They do not leave." Elias took a step back, his mind racing. "Then why are you here? Why do you tend the light?" The old man's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost sad. "I am the keeper of the light. It is my duty to warn those who would come here, but it is also my curse. I cannot leave. The island, it holds me here." Elias shook his head, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. But But we need help. Our ship is damaged. We need to make repairs, or we'll never make it back to port." The old man sighed. "You may stay for a time, but be warned, do not wander the island. Do not trust what you see, and when the tide changes, you must leave. No matter what." Elias nodded, though he was far from reassured. He turned to leave, but the old man's voice stopped him. "One more thing," the old man said. "Do not look into the light. Not directly. It will change you." Elias glanced back at the crystal, its pulsing light casting strange shadows on the walls. He nodded again, then hurried down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the bottom, he found Garrick waiting for him, his expression anxious. "Captain," Garrick asked, "what did you find?" Elias hesitated, unsure of how much to tell his crew. "There's an old man up there," he said finally. "The lighthouse keeper. He says we can stay for a while, but we need to be careful. The island, it's not safe." Garrick frowned. "Not safe? What do you mean?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to make repairs quickly, and we need to stay close to the ship. No one goes wandering off, understand?" Garrick nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "Aye, Captain." As Elias stepped back out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The island seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it were alive, just as the old man had said. And the light from the lighthouse still pulsed in the distance, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows. The shifting sands. The crew of the Siren's Call worked through the night, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the rocky shore. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm that felt almost unnatural. The air was thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the ship. But beneath the surface of that calm, there was a tension, a sense that something was watching, waiting. Elias stood on the deck, overseeing the repairs. The damage was worse than he had feared. The hull had been breached in several places, and the mast was cracked, threatening to collapse at any moment. They had managed to patch the worst of the leaks, but the ship was in no condition to set sail. They would need at least a few days to make the necessary repairs. Garrick approached, his face grim. "Captain, we've done what we can for now, but we're going to need more timber to fix the mast, and we're running low on fresh water." Elias nodded, his eyes scanning the dark outline of the island. "We'll have to search the island tomorrow. There might be something we can use." Garrick hesitated. "Captain, about the island. The men are uneasy. They say they've been hearing things. Voices, whispers, and some of them swear they've seen things. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be any." Elias frowned. He had heard the whispers too, faint and indistinct, like the sound of the wind through the trees. But he had dismissed it as his imagination, a trick of the mind after the strain of the storm. Now, hearing it from Garrick, he wasn't so sure. "Tell the men to stay close to the ship," Elias said. "No one goes off alone, and keep a watch posted at all times. We'll get through this, Garrick. We just need to stay focused." Garrick nodded, though his expression was still troubled. "Aye, Captain." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Elias gathered a small group of men to explore the island. The lighthouse keeper's warning echoed in his mind, but they had no choice. They needed supplies, and the island was their only hope. The island was small, no more than a few miles across, but it was unlike any place Elias had ever seen. Animal bones mostly, but there were a few that looked disturbingly human. He knelt down to examine one of the bones, his stomach churning. It was a human skull, its eye sockets staring up at him with an empty, accusing gaze. "Captain," one of the men said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to get out of here." Elias stood up, his heart pounding. "Everyone back to the ship. Now." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the clearing. But as they reached the edge of the clearing, Elias felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He stumbled, clutching at his heart, and fell to his knees. "Captain!" one of the men shouted, rushing to his side. Elias tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His vision blurred, and he felt a strange, pulling sensation, as if something were trying to drag him into the ground. He looked down and saw that the earth beneath him was shifting, the rocks and dirt moving like liquid. "Get him up!" Garrick shouted, grabbing Elias by the arm and pulling him to his feet. The men dragged Elias away from the clearing, their faces pale with fear. As they reached the edge of the trees, the ground stabilized, and the pulling sensation faded. Elias gasped for breath, his heart still racing. What was that?" one of the men asked, his voice trembling. Elias shook his head, his mind reeling. "I don't know, but we need to get back to the ship. Now." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the island. But as they walked, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. And the whispers grew louder, more insistent. When they finally reached the ship, Elias felt a surge of relief. But it was short-lived. As they approached, they saw that the ship was surrounded by a thick, swirling mist. The mist seemed to pulse with a faint, greenish light, and it moved with a purpose, as if it were alive. "What the hell is that?" Garrick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. The mist was unlike anything he had ever seen, and it filled him with a deep, primal fear. "Stay close," Elias said, his voice low. "We need to get on board." They moved cautiously, their eyes fixed on the mist. As they reached the ship, the mist seemed to part, allowing them to pass. But as soon as they were on board, it closed in again, surrounding the ship like a living barrier. Elias turned to Garrick. "Get the men below deck, and keep a watch posted. I don't know what's going on here, but we need to be ready for anything." Garrick nodded, his expression grim. "Aye, Captain." As the men disappeared below deck, Elias stood alone on the deck, his eyes fixed on the mist. It swirled and churned, its greenish light casting strange shadows on the ship. And then, as if in response to his gaze, the mist began to take shape. Figures emerged from the mist, their forms indistinct and shifting. They were humanoid, but their features were blurred, as if they were made of the mist itself. They moved slowly, their movements fluid and unnatural. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He reached for his pistol, but his hand trembled as he drew it. The figures continued to approach, their forms becoming more defined. And then, as they reached the edge of the ship, they stopped. For a moment there was silence, and then one of the figures spoke. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice a hollow, echoing whisper. Elias felt a surge of fear, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "We are the island," it said, "and you are not welcome here." Before Elias could respond, the figures dissolved back into the mist, which began to recede, pulling away from the ship. Within moments, the mist was gone, leaving behind only the eerie stillness of the island. Elias stood there for a long time, his mind racing. The lighthouse keeper's warning echoed in his mind, and he felt a growing sense of dread. The island was alive just as the old man had said, and it didn't like visitors. The keeper's tale. The mist had receded, but the sense of unease it left behind lingered like a foul odor. Elias stood on the deck of the Siren's Call, staring out at the island. The twisted trees, the jagged rocks, the unnatural stillness. It all felt like a trap, a snare designed to ensnare the unwary. And yet they had no choice but to stay. The ship was in no condition to sail, and the island was their only source of supplies. Elias turned to Garrick, who stood nearby, his face pale and drawn. "We need to finish the repairs as quickly as possible," Elias said, "and we need to find more fresh water. That pool we found. It's dangerous, but it's our only option." Garrick nodded, though his expression was troubled. "Aye, Captain, but what about those things? The mist, the figures. What if they come back?" Elias hesitated. He had no answer to that. The mist, the shifting ground, the whispers, they defied explanation. But they couldn't let fear paralyze them. They had to keep moving. "We'll post extra watches," Elias said finally. "And we'll stay close to the ship. No one goes off alone. We'll get through this, Garrick. We have to." Garrick nodded again, though he didn't look convinced. He turned to relay the orders to the crew, leaving Elias alone on the deck. Elias's thoughts turned to the lighthouse keeper. The old man had warned them about the island, but he hadn't explained much. Perhaps he knew more than he had let on. Perhaps he could help them. Elias made his way back to the lighthouse, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door was still ajar, just as he had left it. He stepped inside, the air cold and damp. It's how it sees, how it communicates, and it's how it lures people here. Elias shook his head, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. But why? Why would it want to lure people here? The old man's expression darkened. Because it feeds on them, on their fear, their pain, their life force. The more people it consumes, the stronger it becomes. And once it's strong enough, it will leave this place. It will spread, consuming everything in its path. Elias felt a surge of fear. "Then why are you here? Why do you tend the light?" The old man's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost sad. "I was like you once, a sailor, lost in a storm. I saw the light and I followed it. But when I got here, I realized the truth. The island, it doesn't let you leave. It binds you to it, makes you its servant. I tend the light because I have no choice. It's my punishment for coming here." Elias felt a growing sense of dread. Is there any way to escape? Any way to stop it? The old man hesitated, then nodded. "There is one way. The crystal. It's the island's heart. If you destroy it, you might be able to weaken the island enough to escape. But it won't be easy. The island will fight back. And if you fail, you'll be trapped here just like me." Elias swallowed hard. "How do I destroy it?" The old man shook his head. "I don't know. I've tried, but the crystal it's alive. It resists, fights back. But if you can find a way, you might have a chance." Elias nodded, though he felt far from reassured. "Thank you," he said. I'll do what I can." The old man nodded, then turned back to the crystal, his hands pressed against its surface once more. His eyes closed, and he began to whisper again, his voice barely audible. Elias turned and left the lighthouse, his mind racing. The old man's words echoed in his mind, and he felt a growing sense of urgency. They had to destroy the crystal, but how? And even if they did, would it be enough to escape the island? As he made his way back to the ship, Elias noticed something strange. The ground beneath his feet felt different. It was softer, almost spongy, and it seemed to shift and move with each step. The trees around him seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. And the whispers were louder now, more insistent. Elias quickened his pace, his heart pounding. He could feel the island's presence, a malevolent force pressing in on him from all sides. It was as if the island itself was aware of him, aware of his intentions, and it was trying to stop him. When he reached the ship, he found Garrick waiting for him, his expression anxious. "Captain," Garrick said, "we've finished the repairs on the hull, but the mast, it's beyond repair. We'll need to find a way to replace it, or we'll never make it out of here." Elias nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "Garrick, I need you to gather the men. We need to talk." Garrick frowned. "What's going on, Captain?" Elias hesitated, then shook his head. "Just gather the men. I'll explain everything." Garrick nodded and hurried off to gather the crew. Elias stood on the deck, his eyes fixed on the lighthouse. The crystal's light pulsed in the distance, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. When the crew had gathered, Elias explained everything the old man had told him. The men listened in silence, their faces pale with fear. "So what do we do, Captain?" one of the men asked, his voice trembling. Elias took a deep breath. "We destroy the crystal. It's the only way, but it won't be easy. The island will fight back. We need to be ready for anything." The men nodded, though their expressions were far from confident. Elias could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw determination. They knew they had no choice. They had to fight or they would die. "Garrick," Elias said, "take a few men and gather whatever weapons we have. We'll need to be ready for anything." Garrick nodded. "Aye, Captain." As the men dispersed to prepare, Elias stood alone on the deck, his eyes fixed on the lighthouse. The crystal's light pulsed in the distance, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. And then, as if in response to his gaze, the light began to change. It grew brighter, more intense, and the pulse quickened, like a heartbeat racing out of control. Elias felt a surge of fear. The island was waking up, and when it did, it would consume them all. The heart of the island. The crew of the Siren's Call worked quickly, gathering what few weapons they had, cutlasses, pistols, and a handful of axes and hammers. The mood was tense, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. Elias stood at the center of the deck, his eyes fixed on the lighthouse. The crystal's light had grown brighter, its pulse quickening like the heartbeat of some great, slumbering beast. "Listen up," Elias called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crew. "We don't have much time. The island is waking up, and if we don't act now, we're all dead men. Our only chance is to destroy that crystal. It won't be easy, but it's our only hope. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and don't let the island get into your heads." "Understood." The crew nodded, their faces grim. They were sailors, not soldiers, but they knew the stakes. They had seen the mist, heard the whispers, felt the ground shift beneath their feet. They knew the island was alive, and they knew it wanted them dead. "Garrick," Elias said, turning to his first mate, "you're with me. The rest of you follow close. And remember, no one gets left behind." Garrick nodded, his jaw set. "Aye, Captain." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural stillness of the island. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches reaching out like grasping hands. The ground beneath their feet was soft and spongy, shifting with each step. And the whispers were louder now, more insistent, as if the island were trying to drive them mad. As they approached the lighthouse, the crystal's light grew brighter, its pulse quickening. Elias could feel its power, a low hum in the air that made his skin crawl. He glanced at Garrick, who looked equally uneasy. "Stay close," Elias said, his voice low, "and whatever you do, don't look directly at the light." Garrick nodded, his grip tightening on his cutlass. "Aye, Captain." They reached the lighthouse and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The crystal's light filled the room, casting strange shadows on the walls. The old man was still there, standing in front of the crystal, his hands pressed against its surface. His eyes were closed, and his lips were moving, as if he were whispering something. "Step aside," Elias said, his voice firm. "We're going to destroy the crystal." The old man's eyes snapped open, and he turned to face them. His eyes were glowing with the same light as the crystal, and his expression was one of pure terror. "You can't," he said, his voice trembling. "It's too late. The island, it's awake." As if in response to his words, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The walls of the lighthouse groaned, and the crystal's light grew brighter, its pulse quickening. "We don't have time for this," Elias said, stepping forward. "Move aside." The old man hesitated, then stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. Elias raised his axe and brought it down on the crystal with all his strength. The blade struck the surface with a loud clang, but the crystal remained intact, not even a scratch marring its surface. Elias cursed and swung again, but the result was the same. The crystal was unbreakable. "It's no use," the old man said, his voice hollow. "The crystal is a part of the island. You can't destroy it." Elias turned to him, his frustration boiling over. "Then what do we do? How do we stop it?" The old man hesitated, then nodded toward the crystal. "The crystal, it's the island's heart. but it's also its weakness. If you can disrupt its connection to the island, you might be able to weaken it enough to escape. Elias frowned. How do we do that? The old man shook his head. I don't know, but you'll need to act quickly. The island, it's coming. As if in response to his words, the ground beneath their feet began to shift and churn. The walls of the lighthouse groaned, and the crystal's light grew brighter, its pulse quickening. Garrick, Elias said, turning to his first mate. We need to find a way to disrupt the crystal. Any ideas? Garrick hesitated, then nodded. The crystal, it's connected to the island. Maybe if we can cut that connection. Elias nodded. Good thinking. Let's try it. They moved quickly, searching the room for anything that could help them. The old man stood by, his expression one of resignation. He knew they were fighting a losing battle, but he said nothing. Elias found a loose stone in the wall and pried it free, revealing a network of glowing veins that seemed to pulse with the same light as the crystal. The veins were thick and fibrous, like roots, and they seemed to stretch deep into the ground. This is it, Elias said, his voice low. We need to cut these. Garrick nodded and raised his cutlass, bringing it down on one of the veins. The blade cut through the fibrous material, and the vein began to spurt a glowing, viscous fluid. The crystal's light flickered, and the pulse slowed. It's working, Garrick said, his voice filled with hope. Elias nodded and raised his axe, bringing it down on another vein. The crystal's light flickered again, and the pulse slowed further. But as they worked, the ground beneath their feet began to shift and churn more violently. The walls of the lighthouse groaned, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking stone. We need to hurry, Elias shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. They worked quickly, cutting through the veins one by one. The crystal's light flickered and dimmed, and the pulse slowed to a crawl. But as they cut the last vein, the ground beneath their feet gave way, and they were thrown to the floor. The lighthouse began to collapse, the walls crumbling around them. The crystal's light flickered and died, and the room was plunged into darkness. We need to get out of here, Elias shouted, scrambling to his feet. They moved quickly, stumbling through the collapsing lighthouse. The old man followed close behind, his expression one of grim determination. As they reached the door, the lighthouse gave one final groan and collapsed in on itself, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Elias and Garrick stumbled out into the open, coughing and gasping for breath. The old man followed close behind, his face pale and drawn. We did it, Garrick said, his voice filled with relief. We destroyed the crystal. Elias nodded, though he felt far from reassured. The island was still alive and they were still trapped, but at least they had bought themselves some time. As they made their way back to the ship, the ground beneath their feet began to shift and churn more violently. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. And the whispers were louder now, more insistent, as if the island were trying to drive them mad. When they reached the ship, they found the crew waiting for them, their faces pale with fear. Captain, one of the men said, his voice trembling. The ship, it's sinking. Elias turned and saw that the siren's call was listing to one side, its hull slowly being pulled into the ground. The island was consuming it, just as it had consumed everything else. We need to get off this island, Elias said, his voice firm. Now. The crew nodded, their faces filled with determination. They moved quickly, gathering what supplies they could and preparing to abandon ship. But as they worked, the ground beneath their feet began to shift and churn more violently. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. And the whispers were louder now, more insistent, as if the island were trying to drive them mad. Elias felt a surge of fear. They were running out of time. The island was waking up, and when it did, it would consume them all. The final tide. The siren's call groaned as the island's shifting ground pulled it deeper, the ship tilting precariously to one side. The crew scrambled to gather what little they could, food, water, weapons, but time was running out. The island was alive and it was furious. The ground churned like the surface of a boiling sea, and the trees swayed unnaturally, their branches clawing at the air as if trying to snatch the sailors. Elias barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Abandon ship. Take only what you can carry. We need to get to higher ground now." The crew didn't need to be told twice. They leapt from the sinking ship, their boots sinking into the soft, spongy earth. The island seemed to react to their presence, the ground rippling beneath their feet like water. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. "Captain!" Garrick shouted, pointing toward the lighthouse, or what was left of it. The structure had collapsed into a pile of rubble, but the crystal, though dimmed, still pulsed faintly amidst the wreckage. The crystal. "It's not completely dead." Elias's heart sank. They had cut the veins connecting the crystal to the island, but it wasn't enough. The island was healing itself, and the crystal was regaining its power. He could feel it in the air, a low hum that made his teeth ache. "We need to finish it," Elias said, his voice grim. "If we don't destroy that crystal, we're all dead." The crew hesitated, their faces pale with fear. The island was alive and it was fighting back, but Elias knew they had no choice. They had to try. "Follow me," Elias shouted, leading the charge toward the ruined lighthouse. The ground shifted beneath their feet, the island resisting their every step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches lashing out like whips. One of the men cried out as a branch wrapped around his ankle, dragging him into the undergrowth. Elias turned to help, but it was too late. The man was gone, swallowed by the island. "Keep moving," Elias shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Don't stop." They reached the ruins of the lighthouse, the crystal's faint glow casting eerie shadows on the rubble. The old man was there, kneeling beside the crystal, his hands pressed against its surface. His eyes were closed, and his lips were moving, as if he were whispering something. "Step aside," Elias demanded, raising his axe. "We need to destroy it." The old man opened his eyes, and Elias froze. The man's eyes were no longer glowing. They were filled with tears. "You can't," he said, his voice trembling. "The crystal, it's a part of me now. If you destroy it, you'll destroy me too." Elias hesitated, his grip tightening on the axe. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, "but we don't have a choice." The old man nodded, his expression one of resignation. "Do it," he said. "End this." Elias raised the axe and brought it down on the crystal with all his strength. The blade struck the surface with a loud crack, and the crystal shattered, its light exploding in a blinding flash. The old man let out a cry of pain, his body convulsing as the light consumed him. And then he was gone. The ground beneath their feet began to shake violently, the island letting out a deafening roar. The trees swayed and twisted, their branches lashing out wildly. The air was filled with the sound of cracking stone and splintering wood. "Run!" Elias shouted, grabbing Garrick by the arm. "We need to get out of here." The crew turned and ran, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The island was collapsing, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the island were screaming in pain. Elias glanced over his shoulder and saw the crystal's light fading, the island's power waning. But it wasn't enough. The island was still alive and it was fighting back. They reached the shore, the waves crashing against the rocks. The siren's call was gone, swallowed by the island. But there, bobbing in the water, was a small rowboat, one of the ship's lifeboats. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope. "Get in," Elias shouted, pushing the crew toward the boat. "Hurry!" They climbed into the boat, their hands trembling as they grabbed the oars. The island was collapsing behind them, the ground sinking into the sea. The trees were gone, swallowed by the churning earth. And the whispers were fading, replaced by an eerie silence. Elias grabbed an oar and began to row, his muscles burning with the effort. The crew followed suit, their faces pale with fear. They rowed as hard as they could, putting as much distance between themselves and the island as possible. As they rowed, Elias glanced back at the island. It was sinking into the sea, the waves crashing over it. The lighthouse was gone, the crystal's light extinguished. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the island disappeared beneath the waves. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief, their oars falling slack. They had done it. They had escaped. But Elias felt no sense of triumph. The old man's words echoed in his mind, a grim reminder of the cost of their survival. The island was gone, but so was the lighthouse keeper. And Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. "Captain," Garrick said, his voice trembling, "what do we do now?" Elias took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We keep rowing," he said, "and we pray that we never see that light again." The crew nodded, their faces filled with determination. They rowed in silence, the sound of the waves filling the air. The island was gone, but its memory lingered, a shadow that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And as they rowed, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the island wasn't truly gone. It was still out there, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting. And one day it would rise again,